Well, happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to 2025. Can hardly believe I'm saying that. It's
Yep, and Happy New Year as well. It's amazing where the time has gone, Scott.
yeah, it was I think we were just chatting before recording, and it was a great, I think we both had a great break and
Mhm.
time with friends and family, and I think the way the holiday felt this year, it felt like maybe a bit of an extended break from work, so it was nice to get away.
Right. Okay. All right.
Um, Yeah, and so we're excited to be back for 2025 and talk about the uncertainty show and what we'll be doing something different to start the new year. Gary, can you tell the viewers what we have in store for them?
Yeah, certainly can, Scott. Well, today's show will be a crossover. It's a podcast that I recently recorded with my colleague, Nancy Hess. Now, Nancy primarily is focused on helping local governments in Pennsylvania, where she lives. I've had the pleasure to be in some of her sessions with police chiefs and municipal managers exploring policing and community safety. In the podcast, Nancy and I are joined by Lou Hayes to talk about his law enforcement experiences in Metro Chicago and discussing the uncertainties that police officers face in their line of duty. When I was doing my podcast with Nancy and Lou, really dawned upon me all the stuff that we have been chatting about on our uncertainty show really applies. And it starts off understanding that law enforcement is a complex adaptive system. Obviously, it has a chaotic system where failure suddenly emerges. And of course, these are the stories of crime, but not just crime, they could be just accidents, everyday accidents, and of course, natural disasters. And with extreme weather and all the things that are happening, that's going to become, I think, more and more of an occurrence. Of course, it has an ordered system to deal with known associations. They have regulations, police standards, rules, and operating procedures, all existing to create certainty and robustness, as you and I talked about. Yes, the manuals are 6 inches thick, but the intent is positive, which is to prevent a fall into chaos. Again, it's that if you see this, then you do that. And a lot of the training that Lou talks about, which he got involved with, is that going through those big, thick manuals. And I'm sure that you and I, as others, we've all had a police incident where the officer went by the book, be it ranging from a speeding ticket to maybe filling out some sort of report. Now, Lou felt there was something missing in all the various training tools he was given over his career. There were times when the circumstances weren't certain, but unpredictable, paradoxical, even conflicting. In some cases, novel. It's a new experience that I've never seen before, and it ain't covered in the manual. And as Lou said, that's how the manual got to be thicker and thicker, because every time this new incident occurred, they keep on adding it to the manual. He knew that a problem can arise if a decision is made to blindly stick with protocols. So, not addressing the present situation may inadvertently enable hostility or danger, not safety, to emerge. So what's Lou really talking about? Well, as we know, he's really talking about that third basic system of the real world, the complex system. We each went through our own discovery phase, as we discussed on the podcast, and we both ended up connecting with Dave Snowden and the Canavan framework, which I recently introduced, and looking at the tools designed to handle complex systems. Now, Lou, in his role as his trainer, he has developed what he calls the Illinois model. Illinois, obviously, because he works in Chicago. And it's a systematic approach to looking at police operations. Won't go through all the specifics, all the of it, because we'll leave the link down below if people want to delve into it. But what he's done is taken the common threads of how law enforcement responds to and handles any type of police call and places it into a universal process that works in a linear order and nonlinear, complex, and obviously the chaotic environment. His goal is to pass on his learnings and help other enforcement officers become robust, more resilient, and therefore safe, carrying out very challenging and high-risk tasks and responsibilities.
Yeah, I like where what we're presenting today, a down-to-earth, practical application. I think law enforcement gives people a really good sense of that how complex an environment can be and how you don't want to fall into a chaotic situation when it comes to law enforcement, or prevent it, obviously, as much as possible. But Lou's involved with enforcing criminal and civilian law that defines public safety. And I can see how organizations, like you say, can draw a parallel dealing with safety laws, regulations, standards that define worker safety. So I think this is a great episode.
Yeah. It's really an application of the complexity-based approach to safety that includes compliance as well as the uncertainties due to unpredictability. So a couple of questions that I want viewers to think about as they listen to the podcast. Do workers understand what situations safety rules must not be broken? But do they also understand when rules may be bent because they sense danger may emerge if they don't adapt?
Yeah, that's a great questions for people to ponder, and that's our brief introduction for today's episode. We'll attach a link to the full podcast, and we'll look forward to getting your feedback, and we'll look forward to seeing you in our next episode in February.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, and enjoy listening to Adaptive Thinking and Leadership in Policing.
The challenges of policing offer lessons for all of us on solving problems in nuanced and potentially dangerous situations. Today, I am joined by Lou Hayes Jr., a detective sergeant in the Chicago metro area, who will share his insights on adaptive thinking and how he applies it to training and problem solving in dynamic, real-world scenarios. Joining the conversation is my colleague Gary Wong, a complexity facilitator with a background in engineering and safety culture. Many of us work in environments with hierarchical or linear policies and procedures that often fall short in addressing the complexities of real-life situations. As leaders and effective team members, we must recognize when a different framework is needed. Adaptive thinking, a central theme of today's discussion, draws from a variety of ideas and frameworks. Gary brings a deep understanding of the Cynefin framework created by Dave Snowden, while Lou shares how he independently arrived at similar concepts before encountering Cynefin. You don't need to be familiar with these frameworks to follow today's conversation, but I'll include links in the show notes for further exploration. Another key framework we touch on is John Boyd's OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, which Lou and Gary reference throughout the episode. I'll also provide links to the resources on the OODA loop. But the critical takeaway here is the need to rethink traditional problem-solving protocols to better address evolving and uncertain situations. Gary highlights storytelling and emotional intelligence as cornerstones of effective leadership, while Lou shares insights from his Illinois model. Both guests discuss why they've moved away from traditional approaches, advocating instead for a focus on relationships, adaptability, and the human side of law enforcement. Perhaps one reason many of us are drawn to crime dramas is their depiction of navigating seemingly unworkable challenges, an experience that resonates with anyone facing ever-changing circumstances. This episode delves into the underlying reasons why Lou and Gary challenge conventional approaches, offering lively and thought-provoking ideas that inspire deeper reflection. Thank you for joining us for this episode. I'm your host, Nancy Hess. Let's begin with Lou, who opens up the conversation by sharing a bit about his background.
I like to say I was a STEM kid before anybody called it that. As a kid, I was always using hand tools. I took apart broken toys, appliances, electronics. And my dad, being a career police officer, started in the U.S. Navy as a machinist mate. So he had a background in using tools and fixing stuff. So around the house, I never really had a handyman or repairman come into the home. Everything was done between my dad and my brothers and myself. But it led me into the sciences and the maths. I went to university to study mechanical engineering just because that's how my brain is wired. I just wanted to get something different. I knew the stories that my dad came home with being a police officer, and I just started getting more and more intrigued by it. When I was home for a summer, I started testing for a local police agency, and I just kept on getting farther and farther in the testing process over the next months. So I dropped out of college a little bit sooner than anticipated with the job offer. I just felt it was a great fit. Even back then and even now, if you're a good test taker, you're in decent physical shape, you don't do drugs, and you don't get in trouble with the police, it's a pretty easy job to get into. But for some reason, I was just really attracted to it in teenage years.
I may have mentioned this to you. I really learned about you through Gary, who is with us. And I want him to interact with you on this next question because it really has to do with I don't know how long you were in policing before you began to conceive of your model, which you call the Illinois model. And we'll link your site to our listeners so they can investigate it. But there is something there about adaptive thinking as opposed to more linear thinking, which so much of policing can be very procedural driven. Gary, maybe you could share what struck you when you first discovered your interest in complexity and maybe see what did you see in that Illinois model?
Just like Lou, I started off in engineering, but I didn't completely get my electrical engineering degree. But I'm sure, Lou, you remember that all that we learned about was ordered system, if and then, causal relationships, physical laws, all that sort of stuff. And that for 30 years really was my engineering career. But I didn't stumble across complexity science until about 2007. And for me, that was a really rude awakening because I realized, oh my God, I've been spending all this time with really one eye open, just perceiving everything to be linear, ordered, and structured. And fortunate for me, got in touch or learned about Dave Thornton. He had just produced his framework. And now he saw, my God, I've got two eyes open now. I can see the world differently. I said, that's where it started to get fascinating for me. And I decided, or maybe back earlier, people were more fascinated the human aspects of what we call complex adaptive systems. Really more interesting, very, if you like, dull, boring world of engineering, where if you do this, then you get that. And that's what kind of led me to my essentially second career that I've had for the past 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you saw the work that Lou was doing, you recognized something in there that felt familiar. And I have to ask you both to just break down for us your understanding of what that means, like that nonlinear type of thinking. What's that definition of either adaptive or complex thinking? What does that mean from your revised understanding of the world?
So I introduced myself as this STEM thinker and engineering student because when I got into policing, I was given a 6-inch thick policy manual that tried to engineer these if-then responses to all sorts of police problems. But I quickly realized that the real world is not as forgiving as math tests, right? Math tests to me were easy, yet I was given challenges in real life that did not have really clear answers. And that nobody was on the same page. So when I looked at complexity in terms of policing, I saw tension and I saw compromise and I saw competition. So One of the things that I learned early on in policing is the Fourth Amendment of the United States. And it talks about search and seizure. And it balances government intrusions with citizens' rights and privacies. And those are two things that are at odds with each other. They are not resolvable. Okay. It's a zero sum environment, right? Where you have to give something up on one end to get something on the other. And that to me is what it's the epitome of complexity, in that it's unresolvable, right? You have to go into this with values. You have to go into this with decision-making factors that there's no answers in this. So I was playing some finite game in math and science when really we're looking at infinite game here, which is you have interventions, not solutions. And when you interact with this environment, you get a response back, and then you interact with that new environment, and it cycles over and over again, which is where we get into Boyd's observe, orient, decide, act, or OODA loop. And this is just a continual corkscrewing through basically through our lives. In
So
policing, it could be through the interaction for minutes or hours of some police incident. I knew that I needed to reframe my decision making from something that was math and answer based, right? Like very numerical, very objective, to learning how to make decisions and navigate more subjectivity where somebody had completely different interests than I did.
Yeah, it's a very black and white world that where we get trained in while going to university. If this or that, so we end up creating, as good consultants, 2x2 matrices. And then and we create dichotomies. And then we realize that maybe it's not either or. My God, it could be both ends. And there's some things that's either in the middle or something better, which is the combination of the either or, which then leads us into this whole realm of creative, novel thinking and maybe a better solution. I also want to say, Lynn, I just want to check with you. When I look at the Illinois model, even though we look at that as perhaps a problem solving, I think what you're doing is going beyond problem solving, not even looking, maybe starting, yeah, because we start with there's something that catches our attention, which is a problem. But I see you going, okay, we can see this as a problem, or else we can see this as something else. Let's pursue that something else and see where that takes us. Am I right or wrong there?
Well, I like where you're going with that, Gary. I've tried to take away a lot of the verbiage around problems or challenges or obstacles. I try to look at things a little bit more neutral. And I don't want to see things as positives. I don't want to see it as negatives. It's just the way that the world is. And maybe there's something I can capitalize on it. Maybe there's something I can make better out of what it is. I think that's a good way for us to approach these, because I think it taps into like our emotional side. Whereas if we see something as bad things happen to us emotionally, that start to shut down certain cognitive portions of our brain. And I think likely we get blinded by things when we see them as being good. But try to take a more stoic approach to this and saying, hey, these are neutral situations. I think it also helps when you're talking with the others, right, that may have different opinions about the situations than us. So saying cops and robbers, right? Police versus criminal. They're trying to get away while we're trying to catch them. Like that is a great tension. That's a great competition. So I want to try to put my brain in how they're thinking about it, right? Seeing things from as many perspectives as possible. So I can see where they're coming from. They could try to see where we're coming from. It's not, because if it's good for me, it might be bad for them, right? But if I start neutering the terminology, I think we can find a lot more common ground now.
Yeah. But I think what we do too also when we use the word systems thinking, I think traditionally systems thinking is about the ordered system. It's about the if then. I'd like to suggest that we go beyond that and think about complexity thinking as well as chaotic systems thinking. So it's a blend of all three systems really make up the real world.
yeah. Yeah, and that was one of my questions, is that, and just as a point of clarification, that when you're working with ideas, this more adaptive or complex situation, you're not abandoning that side which has the policy and the protocol, but and this is actually a question, but for clarity, you're working parallel, or maybe you describe it a different way. You've got both in your mind,
It's the both and that we want
both
to
ends.
see, not the either one.
Yeah. I think about that in terms of safety. It has to be that way to some extent. What do you think,
Yeah.
Lou?
I have some backgrounds in policy design as a supervisor of several different types of units in policing, and then as a trainer with a bunch of different topics that I've been involved in instruction or moderation of. Now, if you look at where ordered policy belongs, is it's in things like uniforms and scheduling and how you fill out traffic crash reports, things that are either more scientific or more black and white, more objective. Even in the financial realm of financial crimes realm, those are more ordered types of investigations than maybe gang crime or homicide cases. We do need to have skills and approaches and mindsets that can work in the ordered systems, right? And match up appropriately the ways that we train, supervise, and design policy around them, but then also understand where our contexts are less ordered or complex or even chaotic, and change our design, the way we supervise, the way that we provide feedback.
For example, could you give us, Lou, just a couple examples of where it moves into that more chaotic or unordered a situation in policing that would take you out of the ordered protocol policy?
So I was a firearms instructor early in my career, very technical domain. And what is generally asked of firearm instructors in our industry is that we teach more and more tactics. We start broadening the things that we're responsible for training others in. So get into building searches and foot pursuit, and rescues and canine operations in neighborhoods and wooded areas or high risk car stops, active shooter response. And if we try to engineer a formation or a response around every single one of those independently, we really risk overfitting. We try to develop too many if thens, and we start losing the ability for us to organically fit what the situation is. There's many times when what starts out as a routine traffic stop turns into a car chase, into a traffic crash, with a foot chase, with an aerial helicopter search, with canines, and then may culminate in a building search because our offender went into an abandoned building, right? So we've got to be able to have that agility to move from one set of tools or tactics that we have choreographed to the next. The problem is that when we rehearse these separately or in isolation, we don't have these fluid transfers. We're not able to transition well from something that went fairly predictably to something unpredictable.
Yeah.
So it's in that unpredictability where we need to be able to make sense of what's going on and start adapting our own tactics to it. So
Yeah.
what I did was started looking at the common threads of what is it that kind of connects all of these tactics that we're teaching our police officers, and how about we teach them to understand those concepts. And that way it doesn't matter what application they're in, they have a core set of concepts in their head that they could build these things on the fly.
I want to get to your teaching. I think that's an important part of our conversation today, but maybe just a little bit before we get to the teaching, I want to relate to something that Gary has talked a lot about within the realm of safety. And it has to do with building a narrative or an understanding of the qualitative data around a particular situation. And from a policing standpoint, I'm curious if building a context is through narrative. Also, is it through relationship? And by that, I mean the ability to work effectively as a group, that people understand within that group how the others think and what they have to bring to the table if you're dealing with a murky, not yet defined situation. What does this look like in real life for you to flesh out a situation that is not clear?
I think stories are super powerful in that policing is a culture of storytelling. We sit around, we drink crappy government coffee during roll calls. We share what happened to us the day before or the shift that just got over. And You learn from somebody else's experiences over and over again. And I go back to Dr. Gary Klein's work on recognition, prime decision making, where we build up these stories, whether we experience them ourselves or whether were exposed to them in, in mere stories, or maybe a video we watched on YouTube of a police officer. And we put ourselves into that situation. We think about what we might have done differently or what we would have done. And that develops this bank of experiences for us to rely on when we're in something that's similar, not exact, but even similar, something that fits okay. So storytelling has been very popular. And I've tried to turn a lot of our intelligence work into stories. We try to look for crime patterns committed by maybe similar or identical criminals, and what it is that they do, where they do it, how they do it, and tell a story of once upon a time, there was a group of criminals that behaved in this manner. And we want that imagery to come up, right? It's getting into the qualitative stuff, not the quantitative stuff. Quantitative stuff is built on dates and times and maybe latitudes and longitudes. But what we want is to start extracting the qualitative stuff that's generally not captured in a lot of the data sets that were used in data analysis or criminal intelligence.
I think there's an interesting element about storytelling. And one of the points that I make when I do stuff is that a story typically is an event that happened, but there are different narratives told by people who see the same event, but they see it from their point of view. And Lou, you have a great article that you wrote some time ago about what is complexity. And this is a story about a Little League baseball game where you've got one kid pitching and you've another kid bat. So if you look at that, there seems to be a narrative depending on which, if you're a parent sitting in the stands and your son is pitching or in the field, the other one's at that. But then there's another story. Sometimes we call it the second story about the mom that's sitting there and she's going, my son is pitching, but my son is also at. What is she going through in her mind? What's her narrative about what happened? I'm sure it's going to be quite different here. That's why I always find it fascinating when people are searching for the truth. And I'm sure in police work that you're trying to find and search for the truth. And maybe there isn't one truth, but there's a whole bunch of truths, different narratives, because people see things differently.
And I think we see them based on what we expect, and our expectations are built on things that we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
That internal orientation that we have that actually drives or influences what it is that we see about something. So when we're building teams, we're always trying to tell stories afterwards to say what it is that I was seeing or thinking or believing was going on. And then we start to appreciate that of our team members so we know more about them, which is why it's so important for us to host roll calls and briefings and debriefings or hot washes or getting together and evaluating these things so we can say, hey, what I thought you did was really messed up. Why did you do that? Well, walk me through that. And they may have seen the situation unfolding completely differently than we did. Right? Not only from physical perspective, where they were mentally or where they were emotionally or where they've come from with their experiences. So it's, we always want to lead with those questions of like, how are you making sense of what was going on?
Yeah. What you're talking about there, Lou, makes me think about just from a leadership point of view, being able to notice what it is that you're already doing in the environment, which makes the group better able to recognize when it's not helpful. In other words, being able to recognize when a situation calls for a more creative response. And I think that's one of the words you use in your model, creative, which I really like. And it's easier to maybe understand what we're talking about. Because I see this on police shows that are really good. I really like it when they use their imagination. They say, this is what I think is happening. I think that's really good. I think that's a skill that the really good detectives employ. But anyway, I digress. I want to take us into the classroom a little bit, Lou. So if you could give us a sense of how you might present or facilitate learning on this concept either of adaptability or another core concept that you might begin with in a new class that is going to introduce a framework that you use, the Illinois model, for example?
But one of the ways that I've started classes is through starting to draw out Boyd's OODA. And that's the full OODA, not just the cyclical 4-step circle. It's full OODA illustration. But I start with orientation. And I ask folks, if you were dumped into a deserted island or if you're plopped into some police emergency, what is it that you bring? And everybody begins with, I come up with my experiences. And what is it that your experiences have? Your experiences bring certain biases and preferences. And those preferences are based on some sort of value, whether those are organizational values that you've been told to uphold, or whether those are something more intrinsic that you've lived for maybe decades of your life. Those are things that we always bring with us. It influences the way we see things. It influences the way that we create decision options, hypotheses, prediction. That's generally a jumping off spot for me. Because then we start breaking down into how do those impact us in different situations or contexts within the police environment? And what are those different environments that we operate in, the types of calls or incidents or emergencies that we respond to, the policies that exist to govern us in certain different contexts or aspects, and start listing them up on a board. And it comes again, how do I request vacation at work? How do I call in sick? How do I interview and interrogate an offender? How do I interview or interrogate a child that's been the victim of a crime? How do I package a bit of evidence? How do I engage in these environments? And we start looking at whether these are more ordered or whether these are more complex or chaotic situations. And we can almost put them into either Kinevin domains, or we could put them on some linear spectrum that starts from highly ordered to highly chaotic and unpredictable. We start looking at what the behaviors and traits are that help you in each of those different types of environments. And students start coming up with management is really necessary in these ordered domains versus leadership is required in the more creative or complex domains. So we start seeing some of these dichotomies of where does a generalist work? Where does a specialist work? How do we know how to stabilize these for specialists? What specialists do we need to bring together to create a generalist team? So they're breaking this down again from policy, from the mindset, from the ways that we supervise, the ways that we provide evaluation or feedback in all of these. And then the timeliness, of course, matters. Is how quickly do we need to come up with decisions? Because when it's very urgent, that might not be the time to have a very democratized decision. Right? You need somebody that's going to be a little bit more autocratic in there. So we look at all these in these different domains, but then we also add this time element. A lot in policing that is urgent. Then there's also full sense of urgency where we'll teach our officers to slow down. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, no, you and Gary, I want you to respond here. I just want to say quickly, you're introducing an interruption to the default rather than going to a default place or thinking I know the answer to this. It is an added. I'm hearing you say there's an added element of let me think about this in a new way before I respond, if I can, if that's available to me. Gary, what is your reflection on that?
Yeah, so things that I do in my workshops is I find that I'd have to disrupt people when they first come into the classroom because they're sitting there and they're saying, so what's Gary going to teach me that I don't know already? No. So what I have to do is help them to unlearn. I find that unlearning is really more difficult than learning. It's how do I get them to let go of all their entrained beliefs, paradigms, models, as Lou says, all their biases that they have built over their career. It's really difficult to let go of these things. So I take them through an exercise And from that, I just say, what you've been doing is great. You've learned how to use a hammer, and you use the hammer really well. But what we've got over here is a screw. And it sounds like to me you're trying to like nail the screw with your hammer. Is this what you want to do? So that's the starting point for me. Then it's hopefully it opens up their minds a bit more. So, well, tell me more. What can we do differently? And I'm curious, Lou, whether you do, maybe what I try to do is I try to, you do start with behaviors because they're easy to see. They're what we call above the iceberg model, so you can see them. But really, I think what we're trying to do is get below that and into the systemic changes. We want to look at, so what are the attitudes below there? What are the emotions that are felt there? Or more than that, what are the system conditions that enable people to behave the way that they do? Because I think
Right.
if we can discover what those are, and that discovery typically takes place in the complex domain where we do probe around trying to figure out why people behave this way, that gives us a good opportunity to say, look, you guys are having trouble with the picking vacation time. Then you guys get upset with each other. But maybe it's the system and the process and how vacations are allocated that we need to examine. That allows you to say, okay, maybe we need to take a learning team, and we need to start probing and looking at a better solution and how we assign vacation.
Yeah. So two things that I heard: the conditions that surround people when they are working through the situation, and also the beneath the surface attitudes, which I'm very interested in. If you're driven by an idea that you have to always be right, or that this is you, or that your reputation rests on the fact that you have an answer.
Typically, what we do is that when we want to solve a problem, we assemble a group of experts. And the first thing that they do there is try to defend where they're coming from, which may be useful as a starting point, but where I think we really want to go is as a group or as a team, take them to a space where they're open-minded to look at other people's perspectives. And again, talk about not one story, but looking at different narratives. From that, can we actually craft different novel sort of solution that as individuals we cannot come to, or we can come to perhaps if we're in a diverse group working together.
And I think when we want to start uncovering that under the water part of the iceberg is we have to start changing our language or giving language to describe things that we're feeling. I'm not the only or wasn't the only cop extremely frustrated with this. This has been probably lifelong frustrations for most police officers, their whole careers. They just didn't delve into the body of knowledge about complexity or complex adaptive systems that I stumbled across. So it gave me a way to describe it, to articulate it, and to talk about it, where I get students or coworkers that say, yeah, now you're describing exactly what the problem is or how I feel about it. So we can start communicating on different levels about these things instead of just more generally I'm being frustrated or that this is too over-engineered or overfitting problems. Or worse yet, all the administrations or the chiefs don't understand what it's like out there. Okay, well, let us talk about the concepts and start applying new language to this.
I like that a lot because I think that's typically how the brain works. If you come across something that's new, you run that Rolodex in your mind and you go, oh, I think I've seen this before, or maybe it fits in this category. And you stick it there. And they miss the actual learning, say, no, this is quite different here. And this is why we want to use this. And I think you've got to, you talk about using just more simple, more relatable language and trying to connect with people so that they can start using it as more words in their new vocabulary.
I'd like to know in the classroom what comes up, Lou, that in the way of this is why this is not going to work back in the department. What are the concerns or the challenges to adopting new ways of thinking about problem solving?
One of the challenges that requires us to relook at everything.
Mhm.
right? This isn't something, these aren't small changes. This is wholesale upheaval. We're looking at changing the way that we write all of our policies, all 6 inches thick of them, right? Into ways that appreciate complexity where it exists and linearity and predictability where it exists. There's a lot of folks that are criticizing micromanagement, for example. How about we start defending it in the right contexts? Instead of the war on micromanagement, it should be the war on misapplied micromanagement. We need to
That's right.
change all of those. And once I start talking about opening up policy or making things more permissive or allowing some more creativity, this isn't wholesale across the board. It's in the right context. We need to look at which context we're writing for, that we're supervising for, training for, debriefing for, right? All of the different realms that we need to change.
Yeah, and this is really interests me because I have worked on police policy before. There would be in those policies maybe an opportunity for, I'm going to just make some words up here, Lou, but you can give me your examples, like a room for reflection or room for having some opportunities to gather more information from small consultation groups. I'm not sure the exact language you might use, but it's broadening what kind of information might go into the outcome as opposed to this very hierarchical. This is what happens, then this person reviews it, then this person gives that there's very specific steps involved in how an answer is derived.
Yeah, that's right. I use these conceptual tiers, right? I start at high level of either goal or objective, and then strategic, tactical, then technical. And each one has a increasing level of granularity or level of detail or concreteness to it. So we sometimes get too granular too early on. Okay. For example, I have a team of detectives. We're going to serve a search warrant, and I have to develop a written operations plan of what that looks like, who's involved, and who's responsible for what on the scene of this search warrant at a house. You can't engineer who's going to go into what rooms, right? That's totally unrealistic. You never know what you're going to reach once you open that door. Assign folks into certain rooms or levels or roles is unrealistic. We should have stopped much earlier on in this at the strategic or maybe tactical levels and never have gotten into the technical level. So what's important at the strategic levels is trying to look at what outcomes we want from this and very broad plans, right? Not who's going left, who's going, but what do we want accomplished out of this? So that's hard for us because if we've been brought up in an engineering environment where we have been handled 6-inch thick policy manual, everything has been very technical for us. So to stop much earlier, more abstract, more concept level, it's almost as if it's like a little too lighty for it. There's not enough meat to it. But we've got to overcome that and understand that we need to have these heuristics based or strategic level plans and stop there. Don't try to over engineer this.
Wow. Lou, and I really do hear like a whole new field of competency that needs to be developed. And I don't know, other than talking with you, which I think is a great idea, and I think that an department should reach out to you. But do you have other thoughts about those who are listening that would like to learn more about these ideas or how to think about policing eh, in how it might look different in using complexity types of theories? Is there a approach or a place that they can go that would have good policing references?
I got to give a plug for a couple of books that have
Okay.
had a lot of influence on me in this area. Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams is by far my most recommended book about this.
Great.
Especially as I delve more into the world of multi-agency intelligence and collaboration, is It's how to create a greater sense of team understanding or this common operating picture, basically group sense making. Team of teams has been at the top of that list. From maybe a little bit more of a police specific realm, Sid Heel's book, Field Command, gets into the fog of and the frictions of conflict. So he starts to take a more militarized approach and start applying it more into civilian policing. Those are two great books. And then I really think you need to get into the John Boyd papers and the Dave Snowden Ken Evans framework and all that body of knowledge. But there's no real repository. There's no real coursework that exists for this. There's a handful, maybe a half a dozen to maybe 10 at most of us in policing that are really in it in the United States. We pretty much know each other. We feed this off of one another. And even it's a very small niche of police trainers they're pushing complexity or complex adaptive systems. On the side right now, I'm learning the French language. And I have no idea what I'm doing because there's not a whole lot of French speakers around me, but I use podcast, books, music, videos, and YouTube. And I'm just trying to suck in as much as possible. And I recommend the same approach is that you got to be complex to learn complexity. You got to take it from every angle. You never know how it's going to stick.
Yeah.
I think what you're expressing there, Lou, is the idea that we've morphed now from the hierarchical, vertical sort of organization into this whole idea of a network community. And it's open. There's no boundaries to it. As you said, you're going to now look at a whole different language, French, and that's going to be part of your network now. And who knows what's going to emerge from that sort of learning and who you're going to meet with that. And once you connect with that person, and because I connect with you and that's connect with you, over time, we'll probably connect with all those French people that you're connected with. And who knows where that's going to take us. And I find that honestly very exciting.
Yep. I want to mention a couple things. One, when Gary and I did work with a group of police chiefs, they responded to that Snowden article in HBR where they applied the sense maker to the field. I think were they in Afghanistan at the time? They were collecting narratives from the field, and then that was really helping command think about what was actually happening on the ground. It's a great article, Lou. I don't know if you're familiar, but we can put that in the notes as well. It's a good reference for police. The second thing is we did do two podcasts, Hugo Marinissen and Bert Brueggemans. They're out of Antwerp. And the podcast with Hugo was on crisis governance. And he talks about team of teams and the networks and integrating all the different emergency services with the big port in Antwerp, how they developed that network. And it was Bert who turned me on to the Carl Weick material, which on sense making, which I am into now, completely saturated with. But he talks about in the fire service is how, that's why I brought up the social bonding earlier. He really talks about the importance of the social bonding that has to go on before the disaster happens, that there has to be some relational understanding about how they work as a team or as a group. And I thought that was just really fascinating. So those are two thoughts. It's exciting, everything that you're presenting here, Lou, and it's a little bit hard to get across in one podcast episode. I have some thoughts about maybe some follow-up ideas, which I will email you about. But I want to also have an opportunity to focus on some of the values that you realize from developing this approach from you personally, which I imagine is very satisfying, but anything else that you can say about the value in developing this approach within a policing department, which makes it worthwhile to investigate if you haven't for somebody.
I think it becomes much more efficient. What we were doing, say, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, was trying to come up with highly specialized policies, specialized checklists, specialized tools. And We always got it with the qualification of this is just another tool for your toolbox. And that rubbed me so wrong because my toolbox got too heavy, right? I had to select the right tool for the right job or else I was wrong. What I'm advocating for now is we teach and give less tools, but the tools that we give are more adaptive, they're more flexible, they're more widely applied. And that if we get really good at them, that we'll do a better job of learning how to apply them and flex them and customize them on the fly. We can't possibly go through life carrying around the super heavy toolbox and expecting our folks to select the right wrench or the right tool for the right problem. And I think one of the pushbacks on this is that no self-respecting mechanic would ever use an adjustable wrench because there is a better tool for it. But we're not mechanics, right? We have so many problems or situations or challenges that we face that we've got to give ourselves better, more adaptive, more efficient tools.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can cut down on a lot of the mental burden that we put on our folks by taking that approach.
Yeah. No, I'd like to know if you feel, from your perspective, that there is a hopeful view of the future in terms of policing and adopting some of these more adaptive ways of designing within the department, designing policy and procedure.
I do think it's going to take a few generations.
Mm,
I think you get folks that are doing the work now that realize this is the way forward. A highly networked, a decentralized, reimagining the hierarchy into what some folks are calling a wirearchy. It's a hybrid of hierarchy and network where we're taking, maybe we're giving more allowances for us to be creative and flexible and go against some standard operating procedure or checklist. They know that this is the way forward. And we need to wait for those folks to get into more influential or more command positions for this to start taking root. Because this is not started from the top, right? This is
mm,
started from the bottom. So we need to just wait for this to bubble up. And with that, I am hopeful.
yeah. That's Gary. Any final questions for Lou or some things you want to add?
Yeah, I think Lou, you've got a good point about there are times when we want to be mechanic, and we pull out the right tool to fix a problem. But there are many times, particularly in community policing, let me suggest that we cannot be recipe followers, that we've got to be more like gardeners and chefs. So we've got to be planting those seeds and nurturing, conditioning the soil, and just allowing all of the, we call them agents in a complex adaptive system, but essentially humans and people to grow and develop. And what our role is maybe to help facilitate that as opposed to trying to manage. I think if we could get that going well, and it's one of the reasons why I dumped my title as consultant and I changed it to complexity facilitator. Just I like your technical philosopher title,
I do too.
really jives with me. I think this is the role that we want to take is how can we develop a role and then watch other people grow and then we can be and be help we can enjoy revel in their success as well.
Yeah. 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 I'm really thinking about this challenge and as being a big challenge, but that's why we're all three talking about this. For all three, that it's very energizing. It's the just that you could plant the seed and get those coming up through whatever profession they're beginning in. As I think about local government, that's where my ground is. And I know they're not eager to change. But here we are. We have to really figure out ways to adapt and innovate in a system that has a lot of constraints and is not prone to that style. But that's the challenge. And I think policing is so many unique challenges to it. So I thank you, Lou, for just doing this work. And it was exciting to discover you a couple years ago. So I'm glad we finally got you on the show. And I hope that there will be some future conversations. I think if we set it up right, we can really create some interesting conversations about this. Today was just an intro.
Nancy and Gary, thanks for talking about this. This was far from a one and done.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of topics that were tickled on this that we could probably go into
Yeah.
a great number of them for another hour or more. You could talk about interview and interrogation for an hour or community
Yeah.
policing for an hour. Yet all of these same concepts apply, which is maybe why this is so hard to talk about is
Mhm.
it's just easier to talk about details sometimes. I think the world of complexity science has helped us come up with some language to talk a little bit better about it. We do have a long way to go.
Yeah. You gave us some great notes, which I will add to the show notes, and we'll be in touch soon. So thank you again. Thank you, Gary, so much for making this possible by introducing me to Lou. And so here we go. Thanks so much.